Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guests are Leni Zumas and Luca Dipierro. Leni Zumas is a professor of creative writing in the MFA program at Portland State University and the author of the short story collection Farewell Navigator from Open City and the novel The Listeners from Tin House Books, a finalist for the 2013 Oregon Book Award. Luca Dipierro is an animator and illustrator. His work appears regularly on record and book covers and in animated films, both here in the U.S. and Europe. And he's the author of the art zine Das Ding and the book of fictions Biscotti Neri. They're here today on Between the Covers as co-creators of A Wooden Leg, an illustrated novel in 64 cards, one that allows, encourages, and challenges the reader to arrange the text and images into any number of possible narratives. Welcome to Between the Covers, Leni Zumas and Luca Dipierro.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We're glad to be here.
So let's start with the genesis as co-creators of this. What was the original idea or impulse that made you want to create A Wooden Leg together?
A Wooden Leg didn't start as the project that we have now at first. It was just a series of drawings that I was making at the time, and they were sort of like very quick drawings. It's my work is generally takes a longer time. But for some reason, I didn't have much time, in that moment. So I started to do these very skeletal drawings, like just pencil, very almost like the most minimal I could go. And then I noticed that there were things that these drawings had in common. So after that, the concept kicked in. So I thought, maybe we could do something that's, has a different length. So I asked Leni if she wanted to write captions. I'm always be interested in a connection between text and image. That is not necessarily comics, but is more like static illustration and caption. And that comes, I think, from children's books, like, illustrated classics where, you have, The Last of the Mohicans or Tom Sawyer or whatever. And, every now and then there's an illustration, a full page in color, and there's a line from the book under the illustration. And that, for me, has always been very fascinating. It's almost like as if the book is being decontextualized in that moment. And somehow you finally see how the characters look like. And it's never how you imagine them. So it's in a way, it's very strange. I always thought that was a very strange moment in which images break the text. So the idea was to do something very radical, to make a novel only of images and captions. So to basically take the novel away and to leave only the captions. And many people would say, well, this is not a novel. And what I think it's, well, maybe it's not, but I think since the beginning, novels has always tried to be what they were not. In a way, I feel like, say, to talk about novels, it's a little bit tricky because what is a novel? And you cannot really define it. And I think it's always good to push the boundaries of what a novel is. And that has happened since, if you think about, even like Stendhal, for example, Stendhal is regarded as the classic novel, where not really. If you read his books, they're very digressive. He doesn't follow any plot. It's very, and that was, in the 19th century. So I think that the idea was sort of a little provocative, but also I think we kind of take it seriously. And there's also the element of combinatory novel, which, it's not new, obviously. Like, think about Calvino, the Cast of Crossed Destinies, which is a series of, tarot cards who put in different orders, build different stories. And I think it's, encouraging people to play. It's always fun. But I have to confess, we haven't done it ourselves. We have not tried to build actually a narrative out of these cards. I think it's possible, but it's a very loose narrative. It's not, you don't expect, characters that come back. It's more a novel in the sense of all images and all captions share the same mood. And I think a novel can be as well about mood and emotional sort of like temperature rather than just plot and things that happen. So and I don't know. I may have talked about too many things at once, but that's sort of what crossed my mind.
And we also are interested in playing on the active participation of the reader and our natural inclination to reach for story and to make story, even if there's only traces of incident or traces of connection among different incidents. So our hope is that people will read these cards. So there's 64 cards with images on the front and little bits of text on the back, and reading them in whatever order you receive the cards in, shuffling the cards, spreading them out on the floor, which apparently some readers have done, and we've been thrilled to hear that. Things are firing in each individual's brain who will read these, and that, to me, is the exciting part. It's not even so much the cards themselves, but the potential in the cards. And of course, that gets back to things like Calvino's Castle of Crossed Destinies and other Oulipian creations, where the excitement lies in what it might be and what it promises to be, rather than a set understanding of what it is.
Well, I think the mention of Castle of Crossed Destinies is a nice one, because it is that fusion of image and text and telling the story through images in a book that is mostly text. But from the literary tradition, Leni, when you think about the endeavor of doing combination, where the reader can choose the reordering or the ordering of the text. You think of like Hopscotch by Cortázar, or even the Raymond Queneau, I think it's 100 million billion poems. Can you contextualize for our listeners that endeavor, a little bit of the history? You mentioned Oulipo. Maybe some people don't know what Oulipian texts are, but also how would you place a wooden leg in that tradition for people who are used to a linear, more immersive,
directed reading, perhaps, of this is the order in which you will read these pages? Well, so Oulipo stands for, I'm going to butcher the French pronunciation, Ouvroir de littérature potentielle, which was a kind of movement started around 1960 in France and included mostly French writers, but some Italian and American and other writers and artists who were interested in play and the challenge of not of randomness per se, but of constraint and experiment and intentional restriction on writing. And so an example could be, as you know, Calvino taking tarot cards as the restriction for his narrative choices, and saying, rather than write about anything, I'm going to adhere to what these images are, the kinds of stories that these images themselves are putting together. And so Oulipians were very interested in mathematics and kind of what happens when things combine in certain ways, or you have an algorithm or a sort of equation that something has to follow, rather than another approach to narrative, which most of us are a lot more familiar with, is the arc, the Freytag's pyramid that follows. There's some characters and they have a problem, and that problem gets worse and worse until there's some kind of apex of conflict, some kind of crisis, and then it's resolved, right? And we can find that in stories from the last several hundred years. But one of the things I think contextually that this work falls under could also be interest, which is more recent than 1960, but in hypertext. There was a lot of work in the 80s and 90s done with computers and imaginative writing, kind of a more highfalutin choose your own adventure, the sense that using hyperlinks and, actually the way the internet works, which is we're reading a narrative and then embedded in that narrative is some kind of clue or link, and we click on that and we go to another narrative. That's what we all do every day. But the sort of hope of hypertext is that we could read our literature that way. And I don't think it took off in the kind of mainstream consciousness in the way that people were hoping it would. But I studied actually a little bit of hypertext in college, and I felt skeptical about it, but I also felt really intrigued by how much attention it was requiring of the reader and how much involvement. So rather than kind of sitting there passively watching the story unfold in front of my eyes, I was having to create the story along with the writer and the text and the computer. So that involvement is, as I said, really interesting to me. But I also think, going a little farther back to the very beginning of the 20th century, Félix Fénéon's novels in 3 lines from, I think, 1906. Fénéon was a newspaperman in France who would write entire stories in 3 sentences or 3 lines, taken kind of ripped from the headlines. And novel, of course, can be translated from the French also as news, nouvelle. But it's a great book. I think you're probably familiar with that book.
I love that book, actually.
Yeah.
And he was loved by everybody. He was, he was editing Colette's husband. He was friends with Debussy, and he was friends with Mallarmé and a whole bunch of other writers at the time. So even though he didn't really write with his name except in the newspaper, he was really seen in that way as a great writer in his own right.
Right, and I love that book. Just to kind of dip into it. I mean, you had mentioned sort of things that don't have to be read in the order that they're printed. That's my experience of that book. It's pages and pages and pages of these little snippets of, Madame Pusey swallowed a bad fish, period. The rain came, period. She was no longer. All these sort of tales of misfortune, but they're so compressed that the reader, I have to put a lot of my own imagination into that.
So back to the idea of combining and recombining, and also that intersection with probabilities and mathematics. Why did you guys choose 64 cards versus, say, 52 cards, which would be a playing deck, or 78 cards, which would be a tarot deck? What was there about 64, if anything, that you landed on that as the number for the deck?
Well, it was just that was an accident, I have to say. We had way more images and captions, but then we started to. So this is how it worked. I need to talk about the process first to answer the question. Basically, there were images first, and then at first we thought, maybe Leni, you could write captions following the images, after the images, but that was sort of like not working. It wasn't interesting enough. So we decided to work separately. So Leni took a look at the images, looked at them, and sort of like got a sense of the mood and everything. And then we decided to find, and we're revealing like sort of a secret here, but it's a good secret to reveal, to find a book that would give Leni sort of like constraints that she could use to build her text around. And so I have this book by this Italian-American puppeteer, which I don't remember his name now, but it's a great book, and it talks about making puppets and marionettes.
It's very technical. It's a manual for how to make puppets.
Almost technical, yeah, exactly. And the mood of that book, even if it's a manual, I find it very lyrical. I think it has a lot in common with the kind of images I was making. So we basically selected together words, random words from this book, words that had like a sort of like a semantic closeness to these images, and so the rule for Leni was to write a sentence around each of these words, and the words were, for example, it could be swell, or
lumber,
or mannequin, or bloody bunny. Things like this.
No, this one was
probably, yeah, exactly.
Well, what's interesting to me is that you came on 64 by accident, because I assumed it came with some intention behind it, and I went and looked it up, and it really is the most. It seems like the number most associated with combination and recombination. So this is what I discovered. So
really?
There's 64 squares on a chessboard. Okay, there's 64 sexual positions in the Kama Sutra. There are 64 units in the genetic code that get recombined, called codons. There's 64 hexagrams in the I Ching, which of course is another form of interplay with chance and recombination. So I was like, oh, this is apparently accidentally is a tradition with this number for some reason that gets used in this recombining methodology, even in biology.
Yeah, I'm curious whether unconsciously or subconsciously, I was thinking 8 times 8, 8 times 8. The pleasure of that symmetry, and I also the number 4 is my favorite number, so I like numbers that end in 4. I wonder if that had something to do with it, or yeah.
Yeah, well, it's very cool to know all this, the numbers, of course, and all those things. But now to go back to the how text and images met, and then we started to combine them to see which text could go with which image, and we were a little doubtful at first, because we thought, maybe they're not going to work.
We spread them all out, all 64 cards out on our dining room table, and then just looked and saw it.
And since these captions were not written directly for these images, it was crazy. And one of the most fun things we have ever done, I think, to see how they would actually fall into place, almost magically, as if, and there was also a little bit of friction between text and image, which I think it's the key to make something, I think, interesting, text image-wise. When the image, it's too much of an illustration of the text, or vice versa, it's a little boring. And this way, it was like almost as if they were touching each other for a moment and then going in different directions. And I thought that was and I think some comic effects come from that.
And you had a more rigorous standard for that, because sometimes I would look at one and, oh, that one goes well with that, and he would say, no, it's too close. It's too illustrative.
Well, I think as an illustrator, I'm always concerned with that, because it's always a risk when you do illustration, I think, to follow too closely the text, which, I think some illustrators do. And, I respect that, but I think I'm interested more in illustrators that try to sort of take a different way, and bring you to a different place. It's like almost as if in the text there are little doors that you open and you go into another room or something like that.
In case you just tuned in, we're talking today to Leni Zumas and Luca Dipierro, the co-creators of A Wooden Leg, an illustrated novel in 64 cards. Let's talk a little bit about your illustrative philosophy and influences. We mentioned tarot, and there are some cards that sort of harken to tarot in the sense that there seem to be these celestial bodies that have faces that are looking down, but there's also the marionette quality and childlike quality of the images. And yet, even with the childlikeness, there's sexual suggestiveness and scatological humor and a sort of creepiness to some of the cards too, I'd say. Is there a tradition that you're referring to that has influenced you, and what is the effect that you're going with combining a lot of elements that people wouldn't necessarily put together in the same image?
Well, there are traditions, I would say, plural. There's a lot of different influences, and I would say just randomly one that I really one author that I really love. He's an artist. I think he died 20 or 30 years ago. Roland Topor, Topor. And he was also a writer. He wrote The Tenant. I think Roman Polanski made a movie out of that book. And he had a very strange, often scatological, but often melancholy humor. And I in his work, I see different moods mixing together, like humor, but also sadness. And in general, I've been always attracted, to different styles, different moods, in one drawing, one illustration. I think you can be funny and sad at the same time, and generally that's what attracts me. I'm thinking about different influences, but I think there's so many, so mixed that sometimes it's hard to name them all, but definitely Topor is one of the first names I can think of. And of course, the traditional marionettes and,
the pupi.
It's they're Sicilian marionettes. That's very strong. There's the creepiness, I think, comes from there, because they're all these things happen to them. They're decapitated or whatever, but their expression is always the same. And I kind of love that sort of mask of resignation almost. And well, I'm glad you mentioned those faces, because to me it's almost like a religious element. Almost like I'm not religious, but I'm interested in religious iconography, and that sort of comes from like religious painting. These angels but it's obviously reduced to the minimum in this. But I think it comes from there. Sort of like.
Well, I've read in other interviews that you cite Pasolini as an influence, or at least an inspiration, and I think of his movie Gospel According to St. Matthew. He's an atheist, he's a communist, but he's making this incredible and innovative film about the life of Jesus, only using his words, but somehow making him seem so unfamiliar to us at the same time.
Totally.
It's interesting.
And also all the bodily functions and that you mentioned before. That I think that there's definitely a tradition of, I think, Italian art and literature and poetry. Even Dante, there's a lot of scatological things in Dante that I think goes through Pasolini. If you see the trilogy of life, it's full of that, and his last movie too. And I think that in a strange way comes into the illustration too, definitely.
So Leni, you have a history prior to coming to writing in recombined cards in your short stories and in your novel around recombining. The thing that comes to mind most immediately is Waste No Time If This Method Fails, which is a story, but is also the sentences are sort of not entirely connected to the sentences on either side of themselves and can be interchanged. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you're inviting that interchangeability, but I would be curious to hear how you see the Wooden Leg enterprise dovetailing with some of the other things you've written that are just text.
Mm-hmm. Well, that story, Waste No Time If This Method Fails, was also written with a very particular constraint in mind. I gave myself the limitation of every sentence either having to begin with either he or I. And so within that, it was really really specific, but I felt I could kind of go anywhere. And so the way I generated that story was just making lists and claims and statements. And I was not thinking about their order. And the order that they appear in the book is itself a bit random. I mean, not entirely random. I kind of played around with many different combinations and started to notice where motifs were appearing and not wanting to repeat things too close together. But that really came after. It was working within the constraint allowed me to simply focus on these nodes or modules. It's a really modular story, and I like working that way because I'm not feeling or chafing at the obligation to answer the question, then what happened? It's more about bearing down on a moment or an image or a piece of language and then releasing it and seeing where it can go. But it's not obliged to answer that question. And similarly with this project, I can write vinegar trembled along the footlights, and I don't have to then say what happened to that vinegar or what happened to those footlights. We can swerve to a different image.
And in your novel, The Listeners, you have characters that have synesthesia, where they're seeing text is color or sound is color. Do you see that fascination with that blending of different sensations? Do you see Wooden Leg as an extension of your fascination with synesthesia, is what I want to say?
Oh, that's a good question. I hadn't thought of it that way before. I mean, certainly one of the interesting things about synesthesia in language, I mean, as you said in my novel, there are a couple characters who have that neurological condition, but it's also about what we can do in language when we're refusing to obey. If there's a visual marker that is not described in the visual field, then it's a way to resist that sort of convention. And I think that what Luca was talking about earlier about the friction between text and image is also about resistance a little bit, saying, this meaning is not closed. This claim or this statement or this description isn't necessarily telling the whole story. And much as if I'm describing sound through image or image through sound, it's a perforation of sorts, and things are leaking into, but from one category to another. And leakage has long been really compelling to me. Things that don't stay where they're supposed to.
Do you have some lines or captions you'd like to read from A Wooden Leg?
Sure.
I know it's hard for us to be able to describe the images that go with them in a way that's going to translate. But
I know. I wish Luca's images could somehow travel over the airwaves because they're really so amazing.
Maybe some listeners with synesthesia will hear your words and be seeing colors, though.
Or you can just buy the book.
Exactly.
They consulted the mannequin's pelvis, where lay a smooth genital bulb, and a blood bunny looking to fasten itself. He trimmed his philtrum with care. The mannequin said, "Ovaries of brass on that girl. A pinch, a thimble. Are you touching cloth?" Plump hood trimmed with fur of buffy-tufted marmoset. The dapperling had strong jaws and a ready root. The rope said, "I am the weed of the palaces."
So when readers who are expecting the fictive spell and the ability to immerse in a continuous narrative and sort of disappear into a dimensionalized world encounter work like this that invites an arbitrariness into the order and also more of a fragmentation of experience, and potentially also invites the reader to work a little bit to co-create the meaning. In your case, with co-creators, it's often not just met with bewilderment by some people, but sometimes with hostility. And I think about the Jonathan Franzen Mr. Difficult article when he wrote about Gaddis's JR that Ben Marcus then responded to. But I would also think just more in general, not even in critical circles, that some people might listen to fragmented sentences like this and go, what is this? Is this really a novel? Is this, how do I enter it? What am I supposed to be doing? Mm-hmm. Can you talk about the reception of A Wooden Leg and how you've felt like the interface with people who might not be familiar with this sort of work, how you've dealt with that?
Sure. Well, your question brings to mind a talk I gave a couple months ago at a different university, and I was presenting. I was talking a little bit about the Wooden Leg project in the larger context of constraint-based writing, and I read a few and sort of was emphasizing the importance of the reader's involvement and active participation. And I heard a couple of snickers and whisperings, and a woman at the back who was actually a very eminent persona at this university said, "What's the difference between what you're doing and the fact that if a monkey types long enough, he'll type out James Joyce's Ulysses?" And
that is a bewildering question to me. That
yes.
that a professor would even think that particularly.
Yeah.
It's offensive too. I mean,
yeah. And I said, "Are you asking me how I am different from a monkey typing?" And she backed off a little at that point, but she said, what you're describing is not necessarily a work of literature. And I think she and there are probably many others who would share this, was expressing a lot of anxiety, I think, about borders and labels and what can be considered literature and what cannot, or what is narrative. And while I happen to find those questions really exciting, I think they're not terribly exciting for some people. They're annoying. They're scary. And it's that question of like, well, why don't we all just write Twitter tweets and call that a novel,
Right.
So there's that sort of reactionary position, but I think underneath the reactionary kind of stance is some very real and interesting worry, about how we tell stories and how we make stories. And so I don't think I necessarily had a good answer for her, and maybe I would never, this project would never convert someone like her. But I think for people who do want to think about all the different kinds of things that story can be, this project might not need that kind of explanation.
Would be interesting if you talk about the uneasiness of not having a good label. If this had been called poetry and someone was able to shift their mind into thinking of the sonic qualities of the sentences versus the narrative aspects,
right.
Maybe they would have been able to hear it differently. But then they would still be unnerved by the fact that it doesn't have a set order of the lines, which would bring us back to that 100 million billion poem by Cano.
Right.
The idea of you're sort of frustrating the need or desire for an order.
Right. And that and a poem that arguably can never be written even because it's so big, that
right.
We can only deal with the idea of it or the potential for it, but we can never really see the thing itself.
Yeah.
And, if one prefers, one could see these as a collection of 64 short stories. That's okay too. I think sometimes actually collections of short stories could be seen as novels. I'm thinking, for example, Hubert Shelby Jr. wrote this book called, I think, Song of the Silent Snow or Chant of the Silent Snow. I don't remember. basically they're short stories, but in each story the character is always the same and his name is always Harry. And they share so much. Just the narrative is not consequential, and it's considered a collection of short stories. But I read that as a novel, for example. So sometimes the line can be blurry. But if I can say one thing about what you asked before. I have a friend, and she's, a woman who's interested in a lot of things, but she's definitely not interested in experimental literature or experimental art. And she's a friend of mine. So once we had coffee, and I brought this project, I wouldn't like this little deck of cards to her, and she looked at it. She flipped through each image, and made me a little nervous because she was silent all the time. And I was like, she's not gonna like this for sure. And at the end, I don't think she was interested in the combinatory nature of the project so much, but she was laughing and she was like, "This is really funny," and so I think there are different levels also of enjoyment of this. I think ultimately, even if you don't accept the fact that it's a novel, it's okay. Maybe just enjoy each piece by itself, and it's probably gonna make you laugh a few times.
Oh,
now it seems I'm trying to sell the product,
so.
But
no, seriously,
it makes me laugh. That's what I'm saying.
It made me laugh a lot. I mean, there's some.
Thank to Leni.
Yeah,
actually,
you strike on these cards that have this particular resonance that catches you off guard, and it is really a delightful read. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the collaborative process, because you said you laid them all out, you'd worked separately some, and then you had to decide how to pair them together. And I know in the Oulipian tradition and people who do constraint-based writing, co-writing is really common, where it isn't really common in literary fiction. So you see it in genre fiction like sci-fi, fantasy, detective, and you see it in Oulipian work. And I know that even when people are doing individual work that is constraint-based, part of the enterprise is the displacement of the ego, not the obliteration of it, but the moving of the ego to the side. So the invitation of chance, the invitation of the participation of the reader. But co-writing also obviously very naturally pushes two egos to the side, or maybe against each other, depending on that. How easy was the decision-making process for the two of you in putting a specific text to a specific image? Was it a contentious process, or was it something that came with a certain sense of ease?
I think it came oddly with a certain sense of ease. I feel like almost as if each caption had. Well, this sounds a little, maybe pretentious, but I feel like almost like each caption chose its own illustration. They just fell into place, and when I think. We could have not selected a different. We could have chosen so many different sequences, but I think the pairing of each illustration with each text is sort of like what worked best. I think they were like sort of made for each other in a strange way. I think it's a retroactive sort of like process. Once you decide that's the right one, you cannot imagine a second choice. But
there were a couple of times, as I mentioned before, where I said, "Oh, just throw that one there," and Luca said, "Well, I think we can do better." I think you actually used that term, which I like. And to me, one of the many pleasures of collaborating with him is I respect and love his work so much that it builds a kind of trust of, I'm not worried about his discernment or his judgment because of how brilliant I think his artwork is. And so I can just sort of say, all right, I can go with that, even if it wasn't my first choice. I'm going to trust his choice, and hopefully vice versa.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it was to me. It was a lot of fun. It was probably the most fun thing I've done, honestly, in collaboration wise. I'm making a book right now. It's an illustrations with another writer, and it's not nearly as fun. It's a lot more work, but it's not nearly as much fun as the one I made with Leni. And also, I have to say, since you had so many nice words for me, I have to say it was reading your text. It was incredible to me when I read all the captions. I was like, this is like incredible. It's like some of your best work, and also like it brought the images to a completely different level. It made them have more meaning and or reverted their meaning. Sometimes there were some drawings that had a certain mood. There was a certain mood to them, and Leni completely changed that. And that was great to see.
As a side note, or it's not really side, it's pretty central. Another constraint we had on this project was that we have an 18-month-old son who was even younger when we were working on this, and the the time suck of living, the fact that when you're living with a little baby, I might have had 5 minutes and no more to write one of these. And it was kind of a relief to be working on a project that I could just spend 5 minutes and complete one of the modules rather than, I only wrote a sentence. Like, that sucks. I still have the rest of the novel to write.
And it's interesting because I think this has been said many times, but I experienced it for the first time probably. I feel like, these all these constraints that we had gave me an incredible sense of freedom. In fact, I felt this project was very freeing and sort of like almost like improvisational, which is strange because we had all these rules and things. But I feel I think that's the good thing about constraint is like that's the real freedom. In fact, when your creativity can like sort of like work within certain like pattern and see what you can do in that little space, and you have to think more. I feel like and so like there's some almost like a certain adrenaline to it. I feel like. Yeah.
In case you just tuned in, we're talking today to Leni Zumas and Luca Dipierro about their novel in 64 cards, A Wooden Leg. So, Luca, you just mentioned the sense of freedom with doing work that has limitations, and maybe Leni can speak to how the constraint-based movement was actually founded around this idea that it actually is limitations that inspire creativity and liberates creativity.
Yeah, I mean, if a lot of the kind of manifestos and essays of Oulipian writers and others who kind of inherited their interest in constraints do speak directly to the sensation of release or liberation or kind of freedom to do things. Rather, it's a different kind of freedom. It's not freedom from limitations. It's freedom to investigate, explore, kind of force yourself into a way of thinking that you wouldn't have arrived at without the constraint. And that to me, if we're speaking because it can get kind of abstract and theoretical, but at a very logistical and kind of concrete level, if you are writing from a prompt or if you are given a set of parameters that you have to work within, it actually is going to ask your brain to do something a little different from what it's used to doing. And in that I think therein lies the great value of it. And many Oulipians and other constraint-based writers are actually not as interested in the product. That the product itself, the writing that comes from this process, does not need to be the most brilliant thing ever made, but the process and the fact that kind of different neural pathways in your brain are being dug and discovered, that in itself is the great value.
But there's also some great examples of amazing products. So, like, I would think of Ulysses, for instance. Like, we could think of James Joyce giving himself the constraint. How can I do the Odyssey, a multi-year journey in one day, told by someone who never leaves their town? So that could be obviously considered a constraint-based work.
It could, and I like that example because often when we talk about constraints, it's per ex avoid a novel written without the use of the letter E. It's a little bit more about form and style than actually looking at the content. If we can extricate any of those from the others, but to say, one day in Dublin, it's just going to be one day, but that day is going to contain the history of civilization, basically, and all these different stylistic registers. Yeah.
And I think, we talked about it before, but I think the role of the reader is really central here in the sense there's, a kind of reader that wants to be taken by hand and shown everything and think, and sort of considers books or comics or art something static, like an object to enjoy that is right just there. And then there's another reader who sort of like wants to do something with the text or with the image and sort of like, and sometimes even go back to imagine to be the writer or the artist and sort of like do that itinerary, sort of like, and maybe in a different way. I feel like there's a lot of the pleasures of looking at art or reading, in my opinion, for me at least, come from going backwards, almost at the origin of the book or the piece of artwork, and sort of like see how it was made in a way. I don't know. There's a sort of like traveling almost, in time and backward and then forward again. So.
Yeah, no, I meant to bring this quote by Lydia Davis, and I forgot. I'm really bummed that I did, because she talks about what you gain and lose by writing in fragments, and in what you lose in sort of that immersive, fictive spell by creating a fragment and then having a suggestive absence is you end up foregrounding the process of how the actual art was created. So the reader, as you said, Luca, participates in viewing the process of the creation in the final product. And it also reveals the consciousness of both the reader and the writer, which I think is really according to Lydia Davis. But that really resonates with what I was reading and intending to read on the air, but failed. So one of the things I wanted to ask also, Luca, was about illustration. You've said in previous interviews that it's considered a minor art, and there's something you like about its being a minor art that has sort of an ambiguous place within the art world.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that is somehow related to what you were just speaking about around the reader participating in the origins of the work. But could you speak a little bit about the fascination with illustration versus another way of making images?
Sure. Yeah, illustration is not a pure art in the sense that it's sort of like, it's concerned with storytelling. And so I feel like there's sort of like a function to it. Well, art is this idea that art is to be pure and sort of, and but my experience of illustration being sort of considered a minor art has been sort of like with me forever, in the sense that whenever I talk to people that do another kind of art, let's say conceptual art, or they're painters, and I talk about what I do, there's always a little bit of that sense of, oh, okay, you're just illustrating somebody else's work, while I think that there's so many cliches that we can find in this, like the idea of originality, the idea that working on somebody else's work, it's for some reason should be like less original than working with So there's a lot of I think ideas about art that probably come from the romantics, probably, sort of like idea of genius, of expression, of originality and thing. But I like the idea of illustration being sort of like really impure. So being concerned with storytelling, being concerned with dealing with a text often, and I feel like that's the way that illustration works better. I feel like it sort of like draws, it seems to follow something, like a text or a caption, and instead it sort of derails you, brings you somewhere else. So I feel like it's a more subtle thing that illustration does than many people think. And of course, there are illustrators that just try to be as close to the text as possible, but even in that case, there's always something that is a little different. For example, one of the things that I always found very interesting in illustration is the gender. Like often, especially in children's illustrations, like little boys look like girls and girls look like boys. There's like this strange ambiguity to it that it's not, sometimes it's not intentional, but it really resonates in me, and I find it like incredibly fascinating. And and I feel like gender is one of them. I think to work with gender is a very interesting thing. If you're an artist, I feel like it's one of the you sort of like step out of your gender and like sort of like have a different kind of position, like more like floating almost like above gender in a way. And I think illustration can do that, sometimes unintentionally. I don't know if I answered.
No, that was a good answer. And this idea of wedding in illustration, how the image is wedded to a text, it sort of also points back to the origins of texts themselves, since all language used to be pictorial. Yeah. Which brings us back to the enterprise we talked about at the beginning by Calvino, the Castle of Cross Destinies, which sort of pushes us to see how when we speak, we're actually hearkening back to when all of the letters were actually images. And you have one card that I think harkens to that. It's, I applaud the analphabets among you. And analphabets can mean illiterates, and it also can mean pictorial languages. And so in a strange way, it feels like a wooden leg is an analphabet, essentially. Like, so it's another form of image text, like all languages were and we've forgotten. Does that resonate with with the two of you?
Yeah.
I love that you found that card. I mean, it's great. That
Yeah, and that also brings there's a kind of issue of translation to the word analphabet. Sometimes Luca, when in speaking English, is he's an amazing speaker of English. He's fluent, but he also sometimes translates an Italian word. There's like a false cognate in English, and he'll, if he was talking about someone who couldn't read, he would say analphabet, or he's analphabetic rather than he's illiterate. And one of my sort of pleasures in listening to him speak is picking up on those really particular kind of literal translations from one language to another that they're not translating into the correct usage, but they're still kind of correct and beautiful in their own way. And so that particular word, which is sort of could be not even mistranslated, but awkwardly translated, I love thinking about those kinds of words and how even within English we can translate from one sort of register of language to another. So translating something from, the origin of translate, the carrying across or bringing into a new place, how that happens back and forth between image and text is also very cool. The importing and exporting of meaning.
Yeah, I think that Italian lens on English or any language's way of making the syntax different and maybe unusual word choices would be a real advantage in this enterprise.
Yeah.
There's actually, since you mentioned Queneau before, there's a great book by Queneau. I think it's a minor, but I think it's like it's incredibly funny. It's called The Diary of Sally Mara. And so he imagines this little girl who's Irish who starts to learn French, and she writes her diary in French. So it's obviously a French full of mistakes, and it's so funny. Just Queneau uses all the possible mistakes you can do in speaking in a language that it's not your own, things that I've done probably during this interview, like all the time, and he makes it into a generative thing. So it generates something, things that happen in language, and it's brilliant. It's very good. It's called The Diary of Sally Mara.
That sounds great. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of your touchstone books. What are influences, both images and text? What are some of the ones that you would point listeners to? They're fascinated by this conversation. They want to read A Wooden Leg, but also want to sort of flesh out their experience.
Something that's popping to mind that is very, very, very different from this project, but that I often think about in the interaction between image and text is W.G. Sebald's work, which in itself is very hybrid work. It could be lyric essay meets fiction meets autobiography meets historical investigation, and he peppers his. He has these long, dense blocks of text. Doesn't use many paragraph breaks, but he inserts images, usually photographs, but sometimes hand drawings into his text, and they work in really strange, subtle ways because, Luca was talking before about things that are meant to illustrate something but don't match them exactly, and Sebald often picks images that seem to be directly corresponding to what he's talking about but aren't always, and it's almost a little invitation to the reader to say, what is this image doing? The image starts to have a life of its own. It's not only in the service of the text. And it's also something that I think makes his work inviting and surprising, and that doesn't happen often in kind of so-called, high literature, literary fiction or literary lyric essays. Often, if you think of an illustrated text, it has its own little ghetto, so to speak. But Sebald kind of doesn't care about those things. So that's one I would think of.
Yeah, maybe I'm going to choose a book of images since it's just a literature. And I was thinking about it right now, and that it could be a progenitor of this project. In fact, a much illustrious progenitor. But it's a book by Max Ernst, the painter, the surrealist painter. It's called, I'm going to butcher French, Une semaine de bonté, a week of goodness. And it's a novel, and that's challenging too because a lot of people wouldn't think that's a novel, made of images and some captions and some words, and in different chapters. And all the images are basically collages from newspaper images. So it's they're like there's this sort of like found image quality, and all the characters look like very, very not very expressive, but it's and of course they're put together in a very surrealist way. So there are people with hawks' heads or horses with people's heads and so on. But it's there's definitely like a progression to it, and once you start to enter that world, you realize that there is a coherence. There is. I mean, it is actually a novel. You start to notice that there are returning elements, and I think maybe ultimately that's what I personally find. I think it's the element that makes a novel a novel. It's not so much length, or it's elements that recur, that come back, and that's what to me makes it. And Semaine de Monte has that, and it's also extremely funny and inspirational. It can lead to very strange places. So,
another one I would add, a more recent book, is one by Leanne Shapton, and I'm not going to remember the title, but it's in the form of an auction catalog, and what it's narrating is the rise and fall of a romantic relationship via a catalog of all the things that after the breakup these two people are selling. And so it has it's mostly image actually on the page, with some captions and explanations of, here's the napkin from the restaurant where they had their second date, or it's a photograph of an object, or and it's a really pleasurable book because it enables a almost kind of a quick skimming read, but then you can kind of bear down on an object and say, oh, why was this important to them? And it's also a mystery story. Why did this relationship fall apart?
That sounds fascinating.
Can I add another one?
Yeah, of course.
This is kind of a classic, but I think it's incredible in the sense of what he does to you as a reader. It's a book by Saul Steinberg, the New Yorker illustrator, and he called himself, it's very interesting, a writer who draws instead of writing. And it's called The Discovery of America. And it's a collection of drawings. Some are very famous, like the view of New York and then the world behind it. But what's interesting is like they're drawings, so they're mute. But each drawing is basically, it's almost like an essay about something. So there's so much in just a few lines. And, it's the power of, I think, of images. And it shows that, you can be smart and literary even by just drawing something. And, it's not, only painting, yeah.
Well, before we end today, can you talk a little bit about the art collective, The Walk, that put out A Wooden Leg, and also your art zine, Das Ding?
Sure. The art collective is very simple. It's just one guy, Isidoro Sevilla is his name. It's a Spanish man who's in love with, I think, very strange things, and so that's why he picked us, probably. And he decided to make in his own kitchen like booklets of artists and writers that he likes, and also CDs. I know he started to put out some CDs. So the idea is more. I think he's more interested in the idea of sharing things than publishing, because these objects are very carefully made, and I think there's a certain beauty to them, the paper and the choice, but also they're very limited editions. So I think he prints like 100 or 50 of each. So he doesn't want to reach a really wide audience, and I can appreciate that. Not in the sense that you have to be a snob or something, but in the sense he knows that there's not so many people interested in that, and he just wants to reach those, and that's it. He's not interested in like a very wide.
And would, if someone's wanting to be one of those people to get A Wooden Leg, would they go to his website?
Yes, I forgot. Yeah, the website is
this is called The Walk.
.wordpress.com.
This is called The Walk?
Yes. I think it's a reference to a song by The Cure.
Interesting.
This is called The Walk.
A Robert Walser story, too?
Yeah, there's a Robert Walser story called The Walk, Der Spaziergang. So that's his website. And I think there's interesting things coming up. And oh, yeah, you asked me about Das Ding. Yeah, Das Ding is sort of like basically just a container for my drawings and for my images. But I sort of like approach it in the way that each time I want to do something different. So if you look at the first Das Ding and at the latest one, the one I made with Leni, they're really different projects. I mean, you can see there's the same hand behind it, but they're really different. So it's sort of like a way to challenge myself to do something that has a relatively short form, because they're not, well, the latest one is a novel, yes, but, it's still like a smaller project that I can sort of it's almost like a laboratory for my work. And I was just putting it out myself, and then I think now the Walk picked it up, so they're gonna print it. And they're all available only through the website. It's a kind of a radical choice, but I think. And
then you have an event coming up in Portland?
Yes, I'm very glad, because I've been living in Portland for 3 years, and the birth of my son sort of like made me not be so much in touch with the art scene. But I have a screening of my animated films, of all my latest animated films at the Clinton Theater. It's going to be on July 3rd at 7 p.m. And the cool thing is that the band, the Italian band that does all the soundtracks for my films, Father Murphy, they're coming just to Portland. They're flying from Los Angeles just to Portland to do a live soundtrack, which is going to be probably a lot of fun.
That sounds great.
There will be trumpets.
And there will be trumpets and horns, yes.
And Leni, maybe just to wrap up the show, what are you working on now?
I'm working on a novel that's really messy and in pieces right now, and I'm in that wonderful private kind of early stage where I can just I'm making messes basically. So maybe in about a year they're going to start congealing and cohering into something.
Well, it's great having you both on Between the Covers today.
Thank you so much, David.
Thank you so much for inviting us.
We were talking today with Leni Zumas and Luca Dipierro, the co-creators of A Wooden Leg, an illustrated novel in 64 cards. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host.